Now, there's nothing more satisfying than a user interacting with our program. We can get the program to ask questions, we can then get responses from the users, and then have our code decide what to do on the back of a response. And you may or may not remember this, but in our very first program, we actually wrote a small program which asked for the user's name and then printed it to the screen. Can you remember what the function was? Now, if not, don't worry, that's exactly what we're about to cover now. So far, we've seen how we can assign variables a value directly in a Python file. However, we often want a user of a program to enter new information into the program itself. And how can we do this? Well, as it turns out, another way to assign a value to a variable is through user input. And this is done by using a built-in function called input, so very easy to remember. The input function allows us to assign information to a variable. We can also display a short prompt to the user to give them guidance as to what input is required before they provide it. A very useful way of collecting information, so let's see it in action. Firstly, if I type out the keyword input and then put a set of parentheses, we can check the documentation and we can see that the input function takes in one argument. It takes in a prompt, which can be thought of as a short message that is then presented to the user. Now, this input function will then wait to receive a response from a user and then read it in as a string. So let me show you what I mean. If I now run this code cell, you can see we get a box and a cursor. You will also notice that our code cell is active as it contains this star, i.e. the program is waiting for some input and it will not go on to the next line of code until that input is provided. So if I simply type in the name James, you can see that when I press return, the cell has completed running and we output James as a string. Now, if we wanted to store this name James in a variable, we could create a variable called name, and then we could set this equal to the input function. And now when I type in James and press return, and then take a look to see what's stored in the variable called name, you can see we've stored James. Now, if I take a look to see what type of object the name variable is, you can see that we're storing a string object, which makes sense because firstly James is a string and the input function itself will always return a string. Now let's see how the prompt parameter works. If I were to set a variable called name and set this equal to the input function, I'm able to put some form of text which will be presented to the user on screen and acts as a prompt to the user when input is requested. And we place the prompt inside the parentheses as a string. So if I put the question, "What is your name?" followed by a colon, you can see that when I run this code, we get "What is your name?" printed to the screen to give the user some form of guidance, and I can now put in the name James. If I now see what's stored in the name variable, we can see we've stored the value James, which is inputted by the user, and if I take a look at the type of object stored in name, we get a string object. Okay, so far, so good. If we now create a variable called age and set this equal to input, and then put "What is your age?" inside the parentheses, we need to be mindful of how the value is stored. So if, for example, I put the age 30 and then press return, and then take a look at what we've stored in the age variable, you can see we've stored 30, but also notice that we have single quotes around this number. And if I take a look at the type of object stored in age, we once again show that it's a string object. So if I wanted to work with the number 30, I would need to convert this from a string into an integer. And the way we can do this is by type conversion. So we can put age equals input, and then "What is your age?" And in order to convert the string 30 into an integer, we can use the built-in int function. So if I wrap the input function inside the int function, and then run the code, you can see we're asked the question, "What is your age?" We can then put an age, so let's put the number 30. You can see that now when I look in the age variable, we've stored 30. And if I take a look at the type of object stored in the age variable, we get an int object. So I can now use this int object in other parts of our code, knowing it takes the form of an int object. Okay, so let's create a very simple character counter, which will simply add the amount of characters you type in a given sentence. So if I start by putting print, and then the string enter a sentence, followed by a colon, I can then create a variable called sentence, and set this equal to input. So we'll be looking to store the input in a variable called sentence. I can then create another variable called length and set this equal to the built-in len function. And then inside parentheses, we can pass in the variable sentence. So this will bring back the length of the variable sentence, which we know has been provided by user input. I can then print out a sentence. So I can print, here was your sentence. Then I can plus a double quote, and then plus the variable called sentence, followed by a closing double quote, for presentation purposes. I can then print, there are, then put curly braces, characters in your sentence. We can then use the format method, and inside the format method, we can pass in the variable called length. Now you can see that when I run this code, we're asked to enter a sentence. So if I type in, I love learning Python, and then hit return, you can see we get back, here was your sentence, I love learning Python, and there are 22 characters in your sentence. So by asking for input, storing it in a variable, performing some form of calculation, and then passing it into a print function for output, we've been able to create a very easy program which obtains the number of characters in a sentence. And I could, if I wanted to, pass this into a function so that anybody could use this functionality. For example, if I were to copy this code and then define a function called character_counter and then put parentheses with a colon, I can then paste in this code block. And when I now call the character_counter function, we are asked to enter a sentence, and I could put, I really love learning Python, and we then get, here was your sentence, I really love learning Python, there are 29 characters in your sentence. So we can call this function elsewhere in our code if we so desire. Now I want to throw in a couple of considerations you should think about when using the input function. Now firstly, if you were to have the age variable that we set above, where we put age equals int with then input asking what is your age. If we were to enter something that cannot be converted into an integer, for example if I type in the word 10, you can see that we run into a value error, and it tells us that we have an invalid literal for int with base 10. So we'd need to put some code in that validates this input in order to capture inputs like this. And we'll see examples of this in the next video. Now secondly, if I once again take our age variable set to int input what is your age, and then run this code cell, and then underneath do a simple calculation. So if I simply put 1 plus 1 and then run this code cell as well, you can see that we're left in a state where we're still waiting for the program to receive an input on the input code line before the next line of code is executed. So as soon as I put in an age, so if I put in the age 23, you can then see that this line of code executes as well as 1 plus 1 straight after, which then outputs 2. So all code beneath an input request will be on hold until you provide that input. And the final thing I want to show you, which can trip people up on their coding journey, is what happens when we accidentally run code that requests input twice. So for example, if I run the age variable with the request input what is your age, you can see we get what is your age with an entry box, allowing us to input information. Now if I were to go back to this line of code and run it without providing any input, you can see that the input box disappears. We know it's asking for something because the star is still next to this code cell, but we have nowhere to put it. And if I try to run 1 + 1 beneath this code line, you can see that this code is also waiting to be run because once again, the input isn't received. Now, if this does occur, we need to restart the kernel. There is no way we can get this input box back. So in order to do that, we need to go up to where it says kernel in the ribbon, and you can then click restart. Now, if you do this, you may need to go back and rerun prior code to recreate the variables in order for your code to work. But this is how you can get out of the position where your request for input, i.e. the box, disappears, because you run the code cell twice. In the next video, we're going to take a look at validating user input so we don't run into error messages like we've seen above. And there are a few simple things we can do to make sure we get the expected input into our programs.